Well, good morning, everybody. I hope you're all having a great morning, a great Saturday, and want to invite you this morning. The thumbnail you probably saw the three cards that I was holding, the three kings, and so I want to tell a story this morning about three kings, and it's actually the first three kings of Israel, and what we can learn from that. Um, Perhaps you remember 4 weeks ago when I did the morning prayer, I talked about the power of habit and why habits are important in our lives. And then 2 weeks ago, I talked about the small things and why small things matter so much. And I kind of want to tie all of that together with the message this morning about the kings of Israel. So I want to start with the first king of Israel. That was King Saul. And King Saul was king for 42 years, for a long time. And actually, the first three kings of Israel were all king for about 40 years. Saul was the youngest son of Kish, of the tribe of Benjamin. And he was just a shepherd boy, which will sound familiar in a minute when we talk about the second king. But Saul was just a shepherd boy, and he was anointed by the prophet Samuel to be the first king of Israel, and he was actually, chosen by God Himself. Saul had a whole lot of success early on in his reign. He defeated many of the enemies of the country: the Ammonites, the Philistines, the Moabites, the Amalekites, um, and part of the problem that the Israelites had at that point was because they'd never really because of problems they had with obedience, they had ended up being scattered across many different places. And when they were scattered, they didn't have a whole lot of strength that they could hold themselves together and defend themselves well. So they ended up being very scattered. Well, Saul was able to unite these scattered tribes and bring them together, which helped increase their strength. He was extremely courageous in battle. He was a generous king, and early in his reign, he was admired and he was respected by his people. He was his people really loved him. But unfortunately, Saul could be impulsive, and he could act unwisely. He let his ego get in the way, and more than once, Saul disobeyed God's instructions. So there was one time where Saul decided that he was going to offer a sacrifice to God, and he knew very well that that was not his role. But I think it was just kind of his hubris that welled up in him that made him feel like he could go ahead and do that. So he was kind of assuming Samuel's office and Samuel's role of offering that sacrifice. And after Saul did that, Samuel informed him that his children would not assume the throne after him, that he would not have a legacy, um, through his own lineage as the next king of Israel. The second time when Saul disobeyed God was when God ordered Saul to completely destroy the Amalekites after a conflict with them, including their livestock. But Saul spared their king and some of their best animals. And then he lied to Samuel and said that the livestock was going to be used for a sacrifice. Eventually, Saul finds out that the next king has been anointed, and the next king of Israel was going to be David, Israel's second king, who, interestingly, was best friends with Saul's son Jonathan. And Saul's jealousy of David drove him crazy and kind of gave him this thirst for revenge. And we'll get a little bit more into that in a minute when we get into the story of David. But the way it ends for Saul is that he kind of loses it, goes crazy, eventually gets into a conflict with the Philistines, a military conflict with the Philistines. And as they're closing in on him, Saul ends up falling on his own sword and ending his life. By the way, I should mention the content today is probably PG-13 rated. So if you've got little kids around, maybe not the best time to be listening to this. Just there's some brutal stuff that happens in the lives of the first few kings. So King David was the king that came after Saul. and he succeeded him on the throne. Now, King David, you may remember, like Saul, was a shepherd boy. Like Saul, was the youngest of his family, and he was also anointed by Samuel. And Samuel came, recognized David as the next one that God would have take the throne. And the story that everyone knows about David, even people who don't know anything about the Bible or are not followers of Jesus Christ, they know the story of David and Goliath. How David, as this little shepherd boy, comes and the Philistines are harassing the Israelites, and David's brothers are off to war. And how King David comes and Saul tries to put his armor on him, and David rejects the armor, and Saul says, well, take my sword and my helmet. And so David goes out with just a sling and 5 smooth stones. Good morning, Estella. And how David takes down the giant Goliath and kills him. And so David immediately gets this hero status, among the Israelites, and they think he's incredible. But this kind of starts Saul's jealousy toward David. And eventually Saul, knowing that David is going to be the next king of Israel, Saul becomes paranoid and starts to hunt David. And so Saul has his army, and as they're stalking David, trying to find David so that they can kill him, there's this really bizarre story where David and his men are hiding in a cave, and Saul needs to use the bathroom. He needs to go number 2, and he just can't wait. And so the entire army stops, and Saul goes into this cave, and he goes to use the bathroom, and it's just not far from where David is hiding. And his men say to him, they're whispering in this cave, and they're like, go and kill David. And think about this as if this were a movie. And Saul walks into the cave, and David walks out holding the head of King Saul, the man that he was sworn to replace. And how, rather than this huge conflict between all of the men following David and all of Saul's army, instead of, this massive bloodshed that needs to happen, only one man has to die. And David could have walked out of the cave holding King Saul's head and immediately assumed the throne. Well, David, as his men whispering in his ear, David creeps up next to Saul and immediately feels on his heart, I can't do this, And so he cuts off part of Saul's robe, and Saul leaves the cave. And as Saul and his men start walking away, David comes out of the cave and he yells to Saul. And you can only imagine the shock on Saul that, wait a minute, David was just in that cave. And he holds up the portion of his robe and kind of shows him, I had the opportunity to kill you, but I wouldn't do it. And David just appears absolutely magnanimous at this time as this future king of Israel. And Saul kind of goes away and lets him alone for a little while. And, David, whereas he could have assumed the throne then, he gets just these mad props from everyone for, look at what an incredible man he was, that he could have taken, in this time of history where everything was taken by might and by power. David could have taken, but he chose not to. And so David kind of has this awesome start to his reign as king, and Saul ends up dying in battle, and David ends up assuming the throne. But unfortunately, just like Saul's start to being king started well and started to eventually go off the rails, David also experienced something similar, where David had this awesome start to becoming king, and then things started to go off the rails. Many of you probably remember the story of Bathsheba. David was king, obviously, at this point of Israel, and while his armies were out at war, David goes up to his rooftop and is looking over the city where he's king. And he's, probably quite proud of himself, of all of the accomplishments that he's had at this point in his life. And he sees a woman bathing, and he asks, who is that woman? And he finds out, well, she's the wife of Uriah the Hittite, Uriah, a man in David's army. And David probably knew who Uriah was. And he says, go get her and bring her to me. And David commits adultery with Bathsheba. And the story doesn't end there. Bathsheba ends up getting pregnant and comes back and tells David that she's pregnant with his child. And it has to be David's child because Uriah is off at war. Uriah hasn't been home. So David sends for Uriah and brings him home and tries to get him to sleep with his wife. But Uriah has too much integrity. He refuses to go home and be in the comforts of home and enjoy his wife while all of his, his coworkers, his fellow army men are off at war. And so David again tries to get Uriah. Well, he gets Uriah drunk and tries to send him home, and Uriah sleeps outside on the steps. And so David realizes that he's not going to be able to get Uriah to go home and sleep with his wife. So David sends him back with a message, a sealed message that says, "Put Uriah in the front lines. And when the heat of the battle is there, pull back." Essentially, he's giving Uriah a death sentence. He sends him back to get engaged in war and then have the army pulled back so Uriah would be killed. And it happens because David's the king and you have to do what the king says. So Uriah is killed in battle. And so David is now not only guilty of adultery, he's guilty of murder as he's had Uriah put to death. And things start to unravel for David. According to the Bible, we know that David had at least 7 wives, and he probably had a bunch of concubines as well. David has to feel the pain from that incident as the child that Bathsheba is pregnant with, David's child, ends up dying. And David mourns and recognizes that that's part of God's judgment on him. That as a result of him doing some awful things, that some awful things will come as a result. And David actually ends up having another child with Bathsheba, one that we'll talk about in a few minutes, and that's Solomon, who becomes the next king of Israel. But the reason that Solomon ended up becoming the next king of Israel is because of some really awful things that happened in David's family. David's oldest son, Amnon, who should have been in line for the throne, ends up getting consumed with lust for another one of children, Tamar, who's Amnon's half-sister. It's a sister from another mom. And Amnon begs Tamar to sleep with him, and she refuses, and so he raped her. And I mean, think about this as the legacy of a father. It's an awful, awful thing what happened. And David becomes furious about this, but he did nothing. And I don't know why. Maybe David felt like he didn't have the moral authority because of his own sexual sins, but he did nothing about it. And so David had a third son. We're not really sure what happened with David's second son. We assume that he might have died at this point. But David's third son, Absalom, is Tamar's full brother, David's daughter Tamar, who was raped by Amnon. Absalom is her full brother, and he's furious about what happened to his sister from his older brother. And so he ends up asking David if he can have a big party. And David said, sure, but I can't really come to it. So Absalom throws this big party and invites all of his brothers to it. And he gets his brother Amnon drunk. And once Amnon is drunk, Absalom has his men slaughter Amnon in front of all of his brothers. And after Amnon is dead, this being kind of Amnon's judgment for what he did to his sister Tamar, Absalom flees north. And once again, David does nothing. And after 3 years, David invites Absalom back to Jerusalem. Now, I'm not sure if I mentioned it or not, but Absalom was David's favorite son. They should have had a relationship. But apparently, Absalom was not able to tell David, like, you need to do something about the fact that your son raped your daughter. And so after 3 years, David invites Absalom back to Jerusalem. tries to repair things. Well, not yet. He invites Absalom back to Jerusalem, and for 2 years he wouldn't even meet with them. And so Absalom is there in 2 years in Jerusalem, and then after 2 years, David sees him and has a discussion with him, but then doesn't see him again. And Absalom wants to talk to his dad, but David won't talk to him. And Absalom starts to get more and more angry at his dad. And so eventually he sends his servants to Joab's farm. Joab is one of David's servants. And they burn Joab's farm down. And this is a way to try to get the attention of Joab so that he can talk to David. And so actually, I'm sorry, I got the story a little bit wrong. David doesn't see Absalom for 3 years. Absalom burns down Joab's farm, and then David invites Absalom back in and starts to repair things, to try to repair things. So he sees him once, but then not again. He started to feel really angry toward his father. And so he devised this plan where he spends 4 years sitting at the gates of the city and resolving people's disputes. Two people have something going between them, and Absalom works things out. And so by doing this, he wins the hearts of the people. And David eventually recognizes that Absalom has the favor of all of the people in the city. Well, most of the people in the city. And that Absalom is probably going to overthrow him. And so David takes his men and they flee the city. And David's now in his 60s. And he's now in the midst of a civil war with his son. And it's a war where Absalom ends up dying in that battle. And after 40 years, David, who's this king who has such high hopes because of these awesome things that he did when he was young, his reign as king ends poorly. And so Solomon becomes the king after David. Solomon, the king of David and Bathsheba, Uriah's former wife. And Solomon's start to being king starts so well as well, where God asks Solomon, "What do you want? Tell me what you want, and I'll give it to you." And Solomon asks for wisdom. And from Solomon, we've got so many of the books of the book of Proverbs, so many of those amazing proverbs that give us this awesome wisdom for how to live our lives. So God obviously gave Solomon the wisdom he asked for. There's this great story in the Bible about how these two women come up to King Solomon, and they're both claiming that this baby is theirs. And so Solomon orders that the baby be cut in half, and each one of them be given half of the baby. And the one woman just shrieks and says, "No, no, no, let her have my child, or let her have the child." And so Solomon says that the woman who says, "Give the child to the other woman," that has to be the mother, because only a mother couldn't bear to watch her child be killed and would rather give the child away. And so Solomon just has this incredible wisdom. And there are a bunch of other stories in the Bible about Solomon's wisdom. And so during this time, Solomon builds the temple, and Solomon brings this tremendous wealth to Israel. And things are just rocking and rolling in Israel, and things are going so well. But Solomon ends up having 700 wives and 300 concubines, we're told by the Bible. And things start to go really badly. Solomon's wives start to turn his heart to other gods. In 1 Kings 11:4, we're told about that, and how Solomon, who builds the temple in Israel, starts building temples to other gods as well. He also began abusing his power and his people. He forced his own people into these slave labor conditions in order to build these temples. And things go south for Solomon. And after his death, Solomon's son Rehoboam succeeds him on the throne. And Rehoboam actually has an opportunity to correct some of the wrongs that his father Solomon has done. But instead, he tells the people who approach him and saying, like, "Hey, like, lighten our load. Don't enslave us to build your temples." He says that basically, what my father did, I'm going to do much worse to you. I'm going to enslave you even more. And so Israel begins to fall apart. 10 of Israel's 12 tribes refuse to accept Rehoboam as their king. And this becomes the split of Israel, where Judah is kind of split off from the others, and Israel is never really fully restored from that point. And so what's the point of all of these stories? We've got three kings whose reigns all began well, who all had tremendous promise, and whose lives all went off the rails because they didn't pay attention to the little things in their lives, because they didn't focus on doing what was right, because they allowed themselves to enter into sin, because they allowed themselves to get distracted by things that were not God's will for them. You know, in my own life, I want to finish well. I'm 39 years old. I probably have half of my life ahead of me, hopefully more than half of my life ahead of me. But life is a marathon and it's not a sprint. And we see this happen so many times where people start out having great lives with great promise, and things end up falling apart because they don't stay committed to doing what's right, because they allow sin to enter their lives. And my greatest fear in life is that because I become an embarrassment to myself or my family or my God, because I allow myself to get taken off track, and because I allow myself to do things that I know are wrong. And that's really where the importance of habits comes in, because it's the little things. It's those little things that we do on a day-to-day basis where we get lazy, where we let our guards down, where we become sated by success, and where we start little by little to slip away from living the life that we know that we're supposed to. DC Talk had this song, a Christian kind of rap band, back in the 80s and 90s. They had a song called "What If I Stumble?" And the chorus of it was, "What if I stumble? And what if I fall? What if I lose my step and I make fools of us all? Will the love continue when my walk becomes a crawl? What if I stumble? And what if I fall?" And I think it's important to remember that a stumble does not necessarily need to be the end. You know, we all sin, we all mess up, but do we get back on the straight and narrow? Do we ask for forgiveness from those who are around us and forgiveness from God? And do we try to correct where we go off track? And that's where the importance of habits comes in. That's where the importance of paying attention to the little things becomes so critical in our lives. Because if we pay attention to the little things, if we spend our lives building good habits and trying to get rid of the bad habits in our lives, we can make sure that we don't end up with stories like those three kings, like Saul, like David, like Solomon, where we start off with so much promise and things end so poorly. I want to read you two scripture passages, and they're pretty long, but hang with me, we're almost done. Hebrews 12, 1 through 13 says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And have you completely forgotten this word of encouragement that addresses you as a father addresses his son? It says, 'My son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline, and do not lose heart when he rebukes you, because the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and he chastens everyone he accepts as his son.' Endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as his children. For what children are not disciplined by their father? If you are not disciplined, and everyone undergoes discipline, then you are not legitimate, not true sons and daughters at all. Moreover, we have all had human fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of spirits and live? They disciplined us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good, in order that we may share in his holiness. No discipline seems present at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. Therefore, strengthen your feeble arms and weak knees. Make level paths for your feet, so that the lame may not be disabled, but rather healed. I just think that's an awesome passage by the writer of Hebrews. And Paul has something that he says in 1 Corinthians 9:24-27 that is very, very similar to this. He says, "Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may win. Everyone who competes in the games exercises," and he's talking about like the Olympic Games. "Everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things. So they do it to obtain a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. Therefore, I run in such a way as not to run aimlessly. I box in such a way as to avoid hitting air, but I strictly discipline my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified." Yeah, I love that passage too, Estella. It's fantastic. So what's the point? We can either discipline ourselves or we can let God do it. We can pay attention to our habits, or we can let God handle that in our lives. We can pay attention to the small things, or we can ignore them and let God humble us, let God discipline us. And I'll tell you, I would much rather pay attention to the small things, pay attention to the habits in my life, um, and try to really focus on doing things God's way rather than let him discipline me. So I hope you feel the same way. I hope this was helpful to you. And let me pray. Father God, I thank you for the example that you gave us in the Old Testament of the three kings, Lord, and how things can go so badly after starting so well. Lord, that we need to pay attention to the little things in our lives, to the habits that we create. Lord, that we need to focus on living life your way each and every day. And that's not something that we just do in our early years, in our teens and 20s and 30s, but that's something that we need to do until the day we die, that we need to maintain our focus on doing what's right, on avoiding sin, on living a life for you. Because sin has consequences, and sin brings pain. And we don't want to experience the pain that sin brings in our lives. So Lord, help us to do that. Lord, help us to root out sin in our lives. Help us to focus on you. Lord, help us to accept other people speaking into our lives and telling us truths that we don't know about ourselves. Lord, help us to allow other people to talk to us about our blind spots. Lord, help us to allow other people to hold us accountable. Lord, have us invite people to hold us accountable in areas of weakness in our lives. Lord, help us to live lives for you, lives that you're proud of, lives that we can be proud of from the start to the end. Lord, I ask that you would continue to work in this country, that you would continue to bring us together. Lord, I thank you for how much you've blessed us. And I ask for you to help us to not take that for granted, to not be sated by success. We give you this day right now, in Jesus' name, and help us to live it in your will and for you. Amen. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that was helpful, and we hope to see you tomorrow on the live stream. Have a great day.